to be doing. I mean, truly thought so.
Inside the Nixon White House, John Ehrlichman, the domestic policy advisor, was one of the few people who had access to the president.
But I want to just what's the matter with these clowns?
Bob Haldeman, his chief of staff, shielded Nixon from everyone, even cabinet members. A directive from either of them, the staff understood, came from the president himself.
Most people in the White House that worked for Nixon had good private morality. They were, I've often said, John Ehrlichman, Bob Haldeman, they were good Christian scientists. They didn't, drink, smoke, or chase women. I often said in Washington that's very difficult. But so they had a good context for private morality. But when it came to public morality, they didn't get it, or they didn't want to get it.
Working below Haldeman and Ehrlichman was a staff of young aides. Jeb Magruder was 34.
Here you are at the center of the world's greatest superpower. The trappings, the chauffeured limos, the state dinners, the guard saluting you when you go in and out. And I remember going on some of Air Force One or two at times, and I was a PFC when I was in Korea. Nobody saluted me then. But when I was in the White House, everybody saluted you. And so we all had this feeling of omnipotence, that we were very important. And in some ways we were, but it was only temporary.
It was a tremendously exciting and thrilling, heady experience. I've got a theory that upon appointment to the White House staff, particularly young people, they've reached their level of incompetence. I mean, that's, I think, the Peter principle in spades. The only suspense is whether you work out of your incompetence while you're there, because issues come along that you have no experience dealing with.
On March 15, 1969, less than 2 months after he took office, Nixon approved the bombing of North Vietnamese supply lines in Cambodia. It was an act of war against a neutral nation, but the Congress was not consulted. And the American people were not told until the 9th of May. The New York Times reported the U.S. bombing, as well as the fact that Pentagon reports had been falsified to keep it secret.
Nixon went dippy-doo and thought that they would have to do something about it. Luckily for them, they didn't do anything about it, and nobody really noticed. I mean, the story went away. There was no real opposition, political opposition to the bombing. If the Democrats in Congress had been alive and they had said, wait a second, what's going on here? But nobody said a word, and 48 hours, 72 hours later, people had forgotten about it.
Except Richard Nixon.
His rage at those who thought that they were serving some greater purpose by leaking secrets was such that he equated the leakers with enemies of the United States and persons who were endangering the security of the United States.
Leonard Garment, Nixon's former law partner, joined the White House in 1969.
And Nixon, being Nixon, went the whole way on that issue and counted their illegality with his own illegality.
The New York Times had revealed to the American people that the U.S. government was bombing a neutral nation, a fact that was not a secret in Cambodia. But in response, Nixon ordered the FBI to wiretap 13 government officials and 4 reporters. No court orders were sought. Attorney General John Mitchell approved the plan.
He saw himself as a wartime president. As a wartime president, the fact that he was searching for leaks, that he was wiretapping for leaks, in his mind apparently was justified. It was just normal operating procedure.
I remember I was in, it was after the November 3rd speech in 1969, his first Vietnam speech. And it was accepted and well accepted by the press and by the people. But there was one person, he knocked the speech. And then someone, I think it was Henry Kissinger, said, well, he's an agent of some communist country in Europe. And the president got very annoyed. And he looked at me and he said, "Jeb, we ought to get that guy." And I'm sitting here saying, I wonder what that means. So after the meeting, I go back to Haldeman's office and I say, "Bob, the president said something about getting that guy. Do you know what he meant?" And Haldeman said, "You heard him. Get him."
In late April 1971, 500,000 people had marched on Washington, the largest peace rally ever. More protests were promised. On May 3rd, Nixon ordered 2,000 Army and Marine troops to line the bridges heading into Washington. Assault helicopters landed on the grounds of the Washington Monument.
All right.
He saw communists everywhere, and he was convinced, as I understand it from something Lyndon Johnson told him when he first came in, that the anti-war movement was being sponsored and backed and underwritten by the communists. Throughout his presidency, he wanted to find evidence of that.
Nixon often said through his press secretary that he was ignoring the demonstrations. The truth was just the opposite.
During these massive demonstrations, I was often filing half-hour or hourly reports with the president wanting to know exactly what was happening, how many arrests were taking place, always looking for that communist link. And neither the CIA nor the FBI could find anything that suggested the communists had anything really of a serious nature to do with this at all. But he was convinced and proceeded on that assumption and just was looking for the evidence.
In a massive show of force, 7,000 people were arrested during the May Day protests, the most ever imprisoned in a single day in the history of the United States. A little more than a month later, on Saturday, June 12th, Nixon's daughter Tricia was married in a White House ceremony. 60 million Americans watched. And for the first time in his public life, Richard Nixon danced with his wife. The stories of the wedding would be overshadowed on Sunday morning. The New York Times began printing leaked government documents that detailed the secret history of U.S. involvement in Vietnam. They were dubbed the Pentagon Papers.
When the Pentagon Papers came out, Nixon saw them for what they were, which was a historical document that indicted the Democratic presidents and their minions who got into Vietnam and lied to the American people pretty consistently about why they were doing it and how they were doing it.
But Henry Kissinger feared their continuing publication would fuel mounting opposition to the war.
Nixon and Kissinger had a very strange relationship, very strange. And they both thought each other was crazy. They may have both been right.
Now, what I understand happened is that Henry Kissinger got the president very excited, told him he was going to be perceived as a weakling.
Hey, Mr. President, they will say you are a weakling. You are a weakling. No one will respect you in the world. No one in the government will ever do what you tell them to again if it's known that they could leak this huge document and not pay a price for it. So within a day or so, he had Nixon crazy.
Nixon got his manhood involved in this, so he was going to prove to everybody how tough he was.
For the first time in the nation's history, the White House went to court to try to block a newspaper prior to publication, despite the U.S. Constitution's First Amendment guarantee of the freedom of the press. Nixon's secret taping system recorded the conversation in the Oval Office.
Do you think, for Christ's sake, the New York Times is worrying about all the legal niceties of sons of bitches are killing them? We're up against an enemy, a conspiracy. They're using any means. We are going to use any means. Is that clear?
If I had to put a sort of a demarcation point in the White House, a before and after, a time when everything changed. It really was the leaking of, and publishing